I am Inspector, and I solved mystery. Welcome to my new case.
It was one of those mornings in Oxford when the air seemed older than the city itself, as though it had gathered dust from every century and now drifted along the High with a faint smell of stone and rain. I had walked early, too early perhaps, into Christchurch Meadow, telling myself it was for the exercise, though I knew it was simply to avoid the silence of my rooms. The grass was wet enough to darken my shoes, and the sound of the river against its banks had the dull patience of something that has carried away more years than it cares to count. I remember, even now, the bells of St. Aldate's breaking the quiet. They were not harmonious. There was one note, flat, obstinate, that fell just out of line with the others, and once I had heard it, I could not unhear it. The defect became the whole sound, as one misprinted letter spoils a page. I thought of Tennyson, though the line came to me broken, like so much else I carried around. Half the night I wasted in sighs, and half in dreams of thee. Or was it not Tennyson at all? It hardly mattered. Memory distorts, and I have long ceased to distinguish between what I recall and what I invent. There are mornings when Oxford seems so steeped in its own rituals that one could imagine it immune to violence. Yet the bells, with their misplaced note, suggested otherwise. A warning, perhaps, though I was never one to believe in signs. Still, I paused beneath the shadow of Tom Tower, listening until the last vibration ebbed away, leaving only the cough of a passing bus and the wet slap of shoes from some student hurrying late to lecture. On a bench near the meadow's gate, someone had left a discarded copy of the Oxford Mail. I might have ignored it had the wind not lifted one page and pressed it against my coat. There it was, an article, small and awkwardly placed between advertisements for second-hand bicycles and a notice of an evensong recital. The headline, restrained to the point of indifference, spoke of an incident in a college chapel. A chest had been found locked, though it was never meant to be, and when it was forced open, a body had been discovered inside. I cannot say what drew me more, the image of the chest or the careless tone in which the paper reported it. The words were factual, almost bureaucratic, yet there was something about them that caught at me. A chest, locked. Inside, a man. No mention of how or why, only that it had happened, as though the thing itself were enough. And perhaps it was. The bells began again, further off this time, echoing across the meadow. I thought of the chest, old wood, brass fittings, a thing that had no reason to be remarkable until someone decided to make it so. That was the way with crime. It transformed the ordinary into the grotesque. A room, a book, a locked drawer, each became theatre once blood had entered the script. I stood there longer than I should, rereading the short paragraph, though there was nothing more to learn from it. The victim, unnamed. The college, unnamed. Only the suggestion that the matter was contained, managed, already under investigation. I could almost hear the clipped assurance of the press officer behind those words. Oxford liked its scandals tidy, preferably wrapped and buried before the dons returned from luncheon. And yet, as I walked on, the discordant bell pursued me, lodging itself in the same part of the mind where unfinished crossword clues linger. There was something unfinished in the report, too, a gap between the lines, like a missing down entry that makes nonsense of the across. It was the absence, not the presence, that struck me. What was omitted had weight. The meadow opened into a pale stretch of path where the trees leaned against one another as if whispering. I felt the familiar ache in my legs and told myself it was age, though I knew it was something else, the body resenting years of whiskey and late nights spent solving puzzles that had no real importance. Still, I preferred the ache to the silence of home. By the time I turned back toward the High, the newspaper lay folded under my arm. I had no intention of keeping it, but neither could I discard it. A trivial thing, a scrap of paper, yet it carried the echo of bells and the faintest sense of something locked away too neatly. I walked on, the headline already receding into memory, but the flat note in the peal of St. Aldate's rang on, thin and persistent, as though it had been struck only for me. Lewis found me before noon, the corridor smelling of damp wool and polish, and carried a folder whose corners had been squared by duty. "We have a name," he said in that careful voice of his, the one he keeps for facts he dislikes delivering. "Arthur Prynne, retired bursar." The rest arrived as cutlery is laid, a wooden chest for vestments discovered locked at morning opening. Within, Prynne, bent into a geometry the human body should not attempt. No forced entry on the chapel door, no shattered latch, the hinges content with their history. Limited keys, limited people, unlimited inconvenience. I asked about the keys because habit insists, and habit is the only theology that survives police work. 3 sets, said Lewis, none duplicated. Chaplain, verger, bursar emeritus. The last title dragged its feet. Men resign stipends more readily than privileges. A key becomes biography once it has warmed a pocket for half a life. We walked to the college beneath a sky that could not decide between drizzle and restraint. Faded wealth met us with good manners. Stone reddened thin by weather, a lawn the color of cool tea, windows that refuse to shine beyond a dutiful blur. Institutions acquire a patina of apology when money has learned to say please. The porter, transported bodily from some older sermon, murmured that visitors would disturb students revising. The dead are beyond disturbance, I told him, and the living must endure theirs. He led us along a corridor that creaked in sentences. The chapel proved small enough to keep a secret and old enough to have collected several. Beeswax lingered in the air with the obstinacy of devotions, and near the chancel the chest sat like furniture suddenly promoted. Brass looks innocent after wicked uses. The metal is shameless that way. I crouched and touched the lip of the lid. The mortise had been oiled recently. It is a domestic act, oiling, and always an intention. Scrape marks were few and tidy, ending where certainty begins. Lewis read from his notebook, and the words came out as though designed for a coroner's ears. Found at 8:50 by the verger, Mr. Hart. No obvious wounds. Estimated time of death between midnight and dawn. No mess. No footprints but the chapel's accustomed scuffs. I nodded for the absence rather than the presence. It is the silence of a place that argues first. The chaplain joined us with the exact air clergymen cultivate in colleges. Apology made flesh. He called Prynne devoted to order, generous with advice, reluctant to resign his guardianship of anything that bore a lock. I asked when he had last seen him at a service. The chaplain looked away into the organ pipes and found a memory that would not oblige. "Keys," I said, and watched the hand. The chaplain produced his from a leather pouch as if returning a relic to its shrine. The verger's ring arrived in a brown envelope that had every faith in labels. Prynne's set, the porter said, was at the house. The widow would be reached after luncheon. Limitation comforts committees. It never comforts me. By the vestry door sat a small table with a visitor's register open to pious handwriting. I ran a finger along the margin and felt a faint slick of polish where no hand should need to rest unless the hand were waiting. Patience leaves a better fingerprint than grease. Beside the register lay a hymn sheet with a penciled correction raising one note by a tone. A light scholar's touch had tidied the error. I thought of the bells of St. Aldate's, that single, wrong note forcing the true ones to collaborate, and felt a minor key in the room. Lewis, who saves his afterthoughts for the middle of things, added that a cushion inside the chest had shifted. Under the lining, a photograph had been found. Prynne, younger, with other men whose faces wore the confidence of those certain they will never need forgiveness. "Keep it," I said. Later is often kinder to images. The hinges told their own brief history when I raised and lowered the lid by a finger's breadth. A lid that shuts quietly will open loudly unless persuaded, and someone had taken pains to ensure discretion. Oil for the mortise, a steady hand for the descent, time enough to be alone with the certainty that no one comes to pray after 10. In the crossword I refused to begin. Chest was both box and courage, vestment both office and disguise, key both instrument and answer. If the lock spoke truth, perhaps the lie lived elsewhere. In access mistaken for. Character, in rituals no one thinks to question, in a college soothed by the arithmetic of limitation. We stepped back into the quad under a rain that had finally decided to arrive. The porter raised his umbrella as if pronouncing absolution and closed the gate with the tenderness of someone finishing a page. The place contracted around us like a book returned to its shelf, and I felt, with the old reluctant certainty, that murder prefers institutions where reticence is worship and silence has tenure. The college received us as a patient host accepts late callers, mannerly to the point of weariness. Rain moved across the quad like ash. Stone released its smell of old lime. In the paneled parlor where they put us, the windows divided the afternoon into narrow panes. Lewis stood by the mantel, reliable as the clock that refused to hurry. Dr. Helena Rainsford arrived first, punctual as a theorem. Her intelligence entered the room before she did. 10 minutes, she said. Essays do not mark themselves. Then, about Arthur Prynne, she offered a tribute that sounded like tidiness. Meticulous, frugal, a friend to records, an enemy to error. I asked whether he was liked. She considered a distant point and said he was respected, which is the adjective used when alternatives are few. Did you attend chapel, Doctor? Sometimes for the Latin. And last night? She let the question pass, the way a scholar lets a shaky footnote find its own burial. Canon Milthorpe followed with a humility that had visited the laundry, a college chaplain of the older kind, courteous, cautious, intensely aware of draught and dust. He told us the chapel was a small perfection and that Prynne had been a generous guardian of its accounts. Locks, I said, have their own liturgy. He smiled and mentioned, unprompted, his researches into medieval verse and church furniture. Old chests are interesting in their devices, he began, and then tidied the sentence away. I watched the tidying more than the sentence. Edmund Vale came last and sat as if the chair had been waiting for him since the 1970s. Fellow of the college, and once Prynne's rival in bursarial arithmetic, he spoke about money with priestly ease. Opposition improves us, he told me. Prynne and I sharpened each other. I said that sharpening sometimes continues past the blade. He laughed, almost, and then grew careful at the mention of the will. Numbers do not lie, he added. No, I said, but those who recite them occasionally do. He looked at the organ pipes as though they might offer an alibi in C major. Margaret Prynne entered with a poise the corridor must have lent her. Thank you for seeing me now, she said. Grief prefers morning light. She wore weather-colored wool and a restraint that was neither modesty nor fear. Arthur liked habits the way others like pets. When I asked about keys, she replied that retirement teaches a person what to return and what to keep. Then she asked, not looking at me, whether the chest had been difficult to open. The question stood between us like an umbrella that had not yet decided for rain. I watched the four as one watches rain decide between persistence and surrender. Helena's gaze seldom found faces. It settled on edges, skirting board, picture frame, the neat row of unthumbed spines. Milthorpe's fingers attended to margins. He aligned the visitor's register by instinct. Vale performed ease like an athlete cooling down. Margaret's stillness felt earned. Cultured civility all round. Beneath it, that faint vibration buildings develop before they crack. On the mantel stood a college photograph. At the end of the front row, a younger Prynne kept his feet turned inward, a stance that shortens a man's stride. I stored it as a future answer. On a side table, a crossword begun in unfashionable ink waited for rescue. 4-letter word, chest. The crossings offered ark, coffer, heart. I thought of bells, of oil, of hands that prefer to close rather than open, and heard again the wrong note from St. Aldate's shouldering its way into the chord. Lewis closed his notebook with the sound of a page agreeing to be turned. We left them to their duties, marking, praying, balancing, enduring. Outside, the quad had narrowed. Buildings do that when secrets begin to take measurements. My leg complained, and the older ache, located nowhere, the body admits, answered it. Respect, I reflected, might only be love that has mislaid its key. Somewhere a door clicked, minor and final, like punctuation lowered over prayer softly tonight. The library steadied me that afternoon. It usually does. Vellum and wax and old buckram make a sober perfume, and the rain on the high windows supplied the bass line. The archivist, a woman who moved as if margins were sacred, conducted me past a varnished warden and into a corridor that narrowed like a thought. There, from a felted box, she produced a small diary whose calfskin had been polished by patient hands and indecision. It had the weight of a pocket secret. I opened it as one opens a door in a house thought empty. The hand was neat without fuss, a scholar's truce between flourish and obedience. The entries marched by weather rather than calendar, mist before chapel, frost along the cloister, doves stupid at noon. Then they thinned, then broke, and the eloquence of what was missing spoke louder than the remnants. Several leaves had been lifted by a blade that respected the margin. On one page, only the dented ghost of a sentence remained, as if the pen had rehearsed a confession and then dismissed it. A passage, almost shy, did not trouble itself with dates. Meet before Compline. No lights. Not the language of romance. Logistics written with an unshaking wrist. At the foot of the leaf, a small square had been drawn with the firmness of a plan. Beside it, 3 characters smudged by the heel of a hand. T-H, and the suggestion of a third mark fading into the gutter. Days, I thought, not names. The chapel is a timetable in stone before it is a sanctuary. Thursday, perhaps. The diary closed over the notion with the well-bred discretion of a lid eased down to avoid a sound. When Lewis found me, I'd been sitting too long under a lamp that turned paper, the color of obedience. He had the expression he reserves for facts that arrive by accident and insist on being dignified. A student at the issue desk had been speaking with the brazen clarity of youth. The chest is always locked on Thursdays, she told the librarian, because the verger hates muddle before Friday's practice. He repeated it without embroidery and added, almost apologetically, that the same student claimed the choir boys treated the chest as law. Touch it on Thursday and expect penance. Who told us first that the chest was never locked? I asked him. No one, he admitted after the briefest economy of pride. The absence had argued, and we had applauded. I felt in that plain light a possibility come to its feet and straighten its cuffs, a thing shut from within, or shut so gently and always at the same hour that no ear suspected closure at all. On the next table lay the Times folded to the crossword, that dutiful square of private theatre. I glanced because habit has its own weak devotions. 8 across, courage required to close this quietly. 4 letters. The definition offered heart and the enumeration agreed, but the wordplay asked for better manners. Close this quietly. P, the polite hush of the musical page. Set it after ark, the old coffer for promises and wood. Park, to bring something moving to rest, to settle, to still. A lid can be parked as neatly as a bicycle against a college railing. I saw a hand that knew how not to be heard. I reopened the diary at the palimpsest and read the blankness as if it were script. If clandestine meetings had taken place before Compline, the day mattered. People bury secrets in routine because routine looks the other way. The tiny square, the hesitant letters, the faint bloom of wax along the gutter, they breathe the same air as the choir stalls and the polished hinge of an old chest. Someone had taken custom and made of it a device. Not invention, simply a practiced exploitation of the predictable. Closing time arrived with the soft admonition of a well-oiled lock. We left the archive to its ordered sleep and stepped into a quad that accepted rain as an old debt. I carried the image of the lifted leaves the way one carries a refusal one intends to honor. The little diagram glowed in memory, like an ember that did not care to announce itself. Somewhere behind the weather, an intention had settled on silence as both method and alibi. Thursdays, I told myself, are for preparations the innocent never notice. The bells, when they felt inclined toward truth, would phrase the rest. High table is always theatre, though the actors rarely admit it. The hall smelled of varnish and tradition, and the candles along the length of oak pretended at solemnity while doing little to resist the draught that prowled through the rafters. Claret, dark and persuasive, arrived with a loyalty that water never manages. I should have refused the third glass, but I did not. And so the evening tilted. Lewis was not present. High table tolerates detectives poorly. I sat between a historian of medieval cartography and a lady from the classics faculty who thought silence a barbarism. Opposite me, Margaret Prynne wore composure with the ease of a well-cut coat. Widowhood had granted her a peculiar authority. People lowered their voices as though her grief might be startled by sound. Yet her eyes, attentive but never dwelling, suggested she was listening for something other than condolences. The talk grew aimless, then tangled itself around Arthur Prynne's estate. A fellow remarked, almost casually, that the bursar had left matters unresolved. Someone else murmured about revisions made late, without witnesses. Words such as codicil and executor were floated across the gravy boats with academic detachment, though every syllable carried a weight that belonged more to appetite than jurisprudence. I drank again, the claret insisting on its finish, and let the argument play out like a fugue. Themes recurring, voices overlapping, nothing quite resolving. Margaret spoke little, which was why her contribution fell with such neat emphasis. Arthur was careful, she said, but carefulness does not always mean honesty. She left it there. No explanation, no demand. The historian beside me adjusted his spectacles. The classicist cleared her throat, but the silence after her remark was the true guest at the table. I studied her hands. Steady, folded against the stem of her glass, too composed for chance. Secrets, she implied, and secrets have their own interest rates. Later, when the claret had claimed its advantage, Edmund Vale addressed me directly. He had the courtesy to call it conversation, though his intention was demonstration. He spoke of accounts, of balances, of the legacy Prynne had preserved for the college, and then, like a man quoting scripture at evensong, he summoned a Latin tag. Custodiam clavem et thesaurum, he said, nodding toward the chaplain as though inviting corroboration. Guard the key and the treasure. The words sounded rehearsed, yet there was a fracture. He had translated guard as though it belonged to custody rather than service, and treasure as though it were physical, not symbolic. My Latin is rusty, but not so corroded I cannot detect alloy. The phrase belonged less to liturgy than to instruction, words carved into memory by familiarity with a chest meant to contain, not merely represent. I asked him, with the false innocence claret affords, whether he had ever been responsible for the chapel furniture. He smiled as though I had praised his tie and answered that bursars occasionally inherit all manner of duties. Then he lifted his glass, ending the sentence in wine. The classicist beside me laughed at a joke no one had told. and the moment was folded away, but not erased. Dessert was a confection too sweet for the hall's dignity. My stomach rebelled, my head heavier with each refill. I withdrew before coffee, murmuring the kind of excuse nobody troubles to remember. Margaret's gaze followed me only to the door. It was not invitation, not reproach, merely the polite assessment one makes of a piece in a game whose rules are older than one's grief. Outside, the night rain had begun, precise as a metronome upon the flagstones. I lit a cigarette, though I had promised myself none. Vale's phrase returned with the persistence of a half-solved crossword clue. Key and treasure. Chest and secret. One misquoted tag can betray a lifetime of use. Back in my rooms, I opened The Times and stared at a clue I could not fill. 8 down, inheritance disputed. 5 letters. Will, of course. The simplest answers wait until drink has blurred the obvious. I set down the paper, closed my eyes, and heard again Margaret's quiet assertion, Arthur was careful, but carefulness does not always mean honesty. And with that, the bells of St. Aldate's, somewhere in the wet dark, found their wrong note once more. Word count, 6:50. The porter brought the boy to the lodge with the care one gives a china cup. Choir scarlet wore him rather than the other way round, and his shoes were polished past their years. The radiator ticked, the rain pressed its slow hand against the frosted pane, and the clock declined to hurry. He sat very straight. He spoke the careful way children do when truth feels like homework that may be set again if done too quickly. He had been in the chapel late, not for mischief, he insisted, but for practice and for the small private miracle by which one voice comes back as 2. 2 evenings before the discovery, he said, there were adults near the chancel. Not shouting. The sharpness of people who have rehearsed their disagreement and can speak each other's lines. One voice he believed to be the chaplain's. It carried apology even when saying nothing much. The other he could not place. He stayed very still, the way animals make themselves into hedges. What did they say? I asked him, and he pressed his lips together as if retrieving a taste. Locked away forever, he said finally, and handled the forever as though it were a coin from a country he had not visited. After that, something about doors being kept. He remembered a second sound as well, a small mechanical cough from the bell rope, as if the tower had been reminded of its duty. He left then, not from fear, he said, but because he wished to return the chapel to the idea of being empty. I sent him off with 2 biscuits and the promise that nothing bad follows truth told steadily. It was the kind of promise adults make because we need it ourselves. Then I crossed to the vestry, where Canon Milthorpe was aligning hymnals with the devotion of a man who prefers right angles to revelation. Children overhear everything and understand nothing, he said with practiced mildness when I reported the boy's story. I told him the boy had heard a quarrel and a phrase with a lock inside it. Quarrels are strangers in holy places, he replied. Strangers seldom choose churches for their arguments, I said. He replaced a pencil in its groove as if restoring doctrine. Rumor, fed a single oat, will pull a coach by evening. Lewis had collected, before supper, a version the college half wished were true. The chaplain and Dr. Rainsford shared late returns from the library, and a sherry in brown anonymity at the buttery, and a reticence that looked as if it had been pressed. I had seen Rainsford pause in the cloister and set her hand on the vestry rail with the absent ownership of a reader touching a familiar book. I had seen Milthorpe leave the reading room with Latin hymns folded under his sleeve like a quiet letter. The ingredients assembled themselves obligingly, and yet the air refused the perfume. No letters, no foolish gifts, no porter keen to be brave after closing time. Rainsford listened to my questions with the grave courtesy scholars keep for potholes. Admiration, she said, is a leisure the term discourages, and allowed the corner of her mouth a movement that could have been irony or weariness. She returned to her papers without requiring absolution or offering it. If there was a tenderness, it had put on sensible shoes and gone home early. I stood again in the nave and examined the bell rope. The frayed end showed a recent polish where a thumb had worried it smooth, and on the flagstone lay a sift of pale dust from the loft. Someone had tugged, paused to learn the interval between sound and echo, and tugged again. The boy's remembered phrase kept sounding in the grain of the wood. Locked away forever. Forever is a small word condemned to long shifts. It can mean the length of a service or the minute it takes oil to make a hinge honest. I rested my palm on the chest. It kept the church's temperature, faithful to neither warmth nor cold. Furniture that has learned to witness also learns neutrality, but oil leaves a whisper no neutrality quite swallows. The lid would close quietly for a hand that had practiced quiet, and the quiet would be taken for piety. A choir boy hears a quarrel, a chaplain straightens a book, a classicist touches a rail as if remembering a line. None of it is proof, all of it is pressure. Back in my rooms I looked at the Times and found a small clue that behaved like a sermon. 4 letters, held in silence. The obvious answer was kept, but there was the other, the one that changed the weather of the word. Mute. A thing can be kept and yet speak. A thing can be made mute so that keeping appears kind. I folded the paper and poured a grudging measure of whiskey. Outside, the rain thinned to a mist that made the lamps perform halos, for no one in particular. Lewis telephoned to say the boy's story would be written up without names. I told him to add the bell rope and to leave the speculation about sherry to those who needed entertainment. He said the place felt smaller tonight. It did. Colleges contract when secrets begin to measure the furniture. I finished the whiskey and listened for St. Aldate's. The bells tried their chord and found it wanting, and the wrong note went on being right enough to matter. Evenings are worst for conclusions. The city shutters its eyes and leaves me alone with the furniture of thought. I walked badly and ended at my desk with the kind of whiskey that apologizes as it burns. Margaret Prynne's composure returned with a steadiness I could not quite forgive. Intelligence lived in her reserve, not coldness, more like a door propped open just enough to suggest kindness while ensuring entry remained a decision. She had spoken of carefulness with the quiet confidence of someone who understood its limits. It was not honesty, she promised. It was poise, and poise has often kept worse things at bay. I told myself, as men of my shape do, that the case had chosen its center. Vale. The arithmetic suited him. Rivalry with Prynne that had learned the grammar of habit. An intimacy with ledgers. The Latin he misquoted with the assurance of a parish brass. Custodiam clavem et thesaurem, he had said, and the words arrived not as scholarship but as usage. He had spoken of the chapel chest as if it were a colleague rather than a symbol. If the will granted him less honor than he had rehearsed, there was motive enough to tidy a life that had grown inconvenient. The pieces obliged. Vale knew the chapel's customs, the Thursday locking, the way the verger polished obedience into the hinges. He could have parked the lid with a quiet hand and left the nave with liturgical calm. He had opportunity, since fellows see their access enlarged by age. The gates opened themselves to men like him. He had the careless freedom of someone accustomed to enter rooms without being announced. I allowed the theory the luxury of an evening and found its angles pleasing. In my mind, I laid out the photograph found beneath the lining. Young men confident that forgiveness would never be required. I placed Vale in the center of the picture because he wished to stand there now. Lewis, who has a sense for timing his interruptions so that thought must prove its value, brought coffee at the hour when coffee turns treacherous. He set down a neat pile of papers, statements, schedules, the sober dust of duty. Among them lay a letter from the solicitors, already read and dismissed, its stationery thick enough to pretend to rectitude. It concerned the appointment of executors and the adjustment of a minor bequest. I remembered the faint vanity of its style and placed it aside, keeping my arrangement clear of clutter. False solutions do not like to be crowded. Margaret drifted back into the middle distance of mind. If she knew, then she had known, long enough to train her grief. She had asked whether the chest was difficult to open. She had not asked whether Arthur had suffered. That, I told myself, was the sentence that chose Vale. Women married to men who love order learn a second grammar, what not to ask when the answer is owed but never given. I set a corridor quarrel about the will. I heard a threat delivered in the neutral vocabulary of college politeness. I pictured Vale's hand steady on the lid, oil smoothing the descent, the chapel accepting silence as worship. When the whiskey softened into a dull patience, I took up the letter again. Habit makes a reader of the idle. Not the sentences now. The dates. Friday in Lent, the solicitor wrote, with an appended note, received by the college that afternoon. Elsewhere, in tidier ink, the porter had recorded that Prynne collected post on Tuesdays and Thursdays only, an economy of footsteps learned across years. Lewis had underlined it. He underlines the world before trusting it, and then the agreeable geometry of my theory shifted like a book returned to the wrong shelf. If the letter was received on Friday, and Prynne did not collect mail on Fridays, then its contents could not have ignited a quarrel on Thursday night. Or, if quarrel there was, it concerned something older than any penitential codicil. Motive without access is a sermon without congregation. The will might have angered Vale. Anger needs knowledge. Guessing seldom oils hinges. I told Lewis that tidy solutions keep bad time. He nodded, not pretending satisfaction, his faith reserved for facts that survive the morning. Outside, the rain found the pavement with the restraint of someone recalling a tune from childhood. I poured the last inch and let the room go dim at the edges. Margaret's calm persisted, unhelpful and exact, like a candle kept for power cuts that never quite arrive. The letter, obstinate in its Friday certainty, sat upon the pile like a small parish refusing merger. The chest, which had played altar and accomplice, kept its counsel. I opened the crossword as one opens a window. 4 letters, neat but wrong. The answer, I decided, was Vale. My pencil hovered, then waited. I closed the paper, and somewhere beyond the wet glass, the bells of St. Aldate's attempted their chord, missed it, and made of the error something one could almost admire. Lewis found it while pretending not to search. He had lifted the end cushion in the front pew to tighten a screw, and there it lay, thin as a confession, flattened by years of hymns. He brought it to me without ceremony, the way one carries a message that has already decided how it will be heard. In the vestry light, the photograph kept its own weather, silvering at the edges, a slight curve where a thumb had been faithful too long. Students, decades younger than their later titles, arranged in the unembarrassed confidence of summer. I recognized Arthur Prynne by the exactness of his tie and the inward tilt of his feet. Edmund Vale stood beside him with a kind of ease that passes for charm until it is needed. And, unexpectedly, Canon Milthorpe without collar or caution. A tall, tentative youth whose mouth seemed trained to agree. Others flanked them but have since dissolved into anonymity. Behind the group, half inside the frame, the chapel chest gleamed as if it had just learned its purpose. They knew one another when mischief was still cheap, said Lewis in the tone he uses to domesticate discovery. I let the thought settle. Youth buys debts that mature only when institutions decide to remember. I studied their spacing. Prynne and Vale, not quite touching, posed as if an argument had been paused for the camera. Milthorpe half a pace behind, the deference of a guest who longs to belong without owing. Friendships have topography. This one sloped toward the chest. What were they then, before they became administrators and apologists? A society in all but name, perhaps, a club for seriousness disguised as prank. The brass on the lid shone with a cleanliness I no longer associated with devotion. Later hands had learned to touch it cautiously. I thought, not idly, that furniture ages with those who learn its tricks, and the thought refused dismissal. Thursday came back to me, the diary's penciled square, the choir boy's shy phrase about forever. Secrets favor routine because routine learns to keep them. We turned the photograph over with the gentleness we reserve for evidence we would prefer to be innocent. No names, only a date rubbed down to the courteous ghost of a 9. I looked again at the front and allowed my gaze to rest on the betrayal's photographs, cannot help recording. Vale's right hand half closed as though around a thing he had not yet decided to keep. Prynne's eyes not on the lens, but a fraction to the right, towards someone standing just outside the frame. Milthorpe's shoes polished a shade too perfectly, the labor of another pair of hands. Details apply for membership of a story. One grants admission slowly. The cushion itself had a narrow tear along the seam nearest the aisle. Under the lining, a sliver of wax had lodged, brittle and ivory. Candle wax rarely travels alone. It follows the faithful and the sly. Lewis offered the obvious. Choral practice, second-hand drips. And I let the obvious stand for a moment, like a porter doing his best. Perhaps, I said, and listened to the bell rope release a mild breath of dust into the light. The photograph had lived where silence lives, in places chosen for being ignored. What is hidden badly invites discovery. What is hidden well learns the accent of furniture. If our tale belonged to inheritance, the picture argued for an older grammar. Rivalries hardened by ledgers can be born from the hilarities of youth. I saw, without help from claret, that whatever bound these three had been knotted earlier than any will. The chest was not a prop borrowed for murder. It was a stage they had rehearsed upon. And when men perform the same trick for years, the trick learns them. I walked the nave and placed the photograph on the lid as one lays a mirror over a wound. For a breath, the young men stood above their older selves, and the wood accepted the overlay without taking sides. Milthorpe remained a fraction back even in youth. Vale had already learned to be central without appearing to demand it. Prynne was precise, the custodian rehearsing for a future translation into a lock. From the tower there came a practice stroke, a single note that tried not to be heard, and therefore was. We left the chapel to its beeswax and borrowed light. Back in my rooms, the evening gathered itself along the skirting like a patient cat. I opened the Times and met a clue that declined ornament. 6 letters, history's residue. Patina would do, but it flattered surfaces. I wrote memory and liked its hush. The photograph lay between blotter and lamp, and I allowed myself the ungenerous comfort of believing that the motive had chosen its men long before money volunteered. Outside, rain began with the courtesy Oxford reserves for old acquaintances. The bells of St. Aldate's tried their chord and missed it by that same obstinate fraction, as if insisting that harmony is simply habit, refusing to acknowledge what the past has already arranged. I sat a while with the picture and the wax and the thought that the present seldom kills alone. It is the past that selects the instrument and supplies the hand. There are evenings when the crossword takes on the texture of confession, not for its clues, which remain the work of someone paid to be mischievous, but for the way solutions arrive, late, embarrassed, almost against their own will. I sat in my rooms with the day's paper folded to that square, pen idle until the whiskey softened its reluctance. The clue read, puzzle within box, 6 letters, and there it was, obvious once ignored long enough. Enigma. The letters intersected with chest, 5 across, definition. Container of secrets. The page made its own sermon, uninvited. Chest and enigma, the 2 words occupying one another like a riddle that had grown tired of discretion. I turned back to the diary. Its absences glared, but absences often do when coaxed by alcohol. One missing page had carried the faint impression of penciled squares. Another, the dent of a single word erased before it had finished being written. The choir boy's memory returned then, his careful voice speaking of the quarrel near the chancel and the phrase he had been shy to repeat. Locked away forever. Forever does not belong in youthful mouths. It sounded borrowed, rehearsed, placed there by someone who had already lived with its ache. And so I read the missing pages not for what had been said, but for the silences they had been taught to preserve. Thursday nights, Compline, no lights. The chapel chest stood within reach of that silence, patient as furniture trained to keep faith. Dr. Helena Rainsford had answered my questions with a scholar's precision. She disliked hesitation. She found refuge in syntax. I remembered her saying she attended chapel for the Latin sometimes when time allowed, but she had not said she had been there recently. Not said she had been absent, either. The omission wore the politeness of academic restraint. A classicist knows how to defend by choosing not to annotate. Perhaps the diary belonged to her. Perhaps the erased initials had included her own. To be named in the register of clandestine meetings, to be linked with a quarrel overheard by a choir boy, to be seen pausing at the vestry rail as if testing memory's claim. These made an architecture that would almost stand. It was a tempting construction. A woman, brilliant, pressed into secrecy, her career vulnerable to exposure, her temper worn by the arithmetic of men. Prynne, the bursar, who collected secrets as others collect accounts, may have threatened disclosure. Helena silenced him not for passion, but for survival. And veil, convenient rival, became the camouflage for her true motive. I laid the story out like a problem in logic and found its corners pleasing. The false trail always offers symmetry. Symmetry deceives better than chaos. Yet even as I entertained the thought, I saw the gaps. The quarrel's phrase did not suit her diction. Forever belonged less to the cool intelligence of Rainsford than to the anxious devotions of Milthorpe or the nervous vanity of Vale. And the photograph, still on my desk, showed her nowhere near those three in youth. If secrets had been formed in the chapel, they had been formed before her arrival. She could not inherit debts she had never signed. The elegance of the theory refused to walk. I glanced back at the crossword. Chest crossing enigma. I had written them too firmly, as if needing permanence where nothing deserved it. Underneath, another clue stared. 8 down, misleading appearance, 7 letters. Facade, I scribbled, though I left the letters faint. The puzzle was reminding me of my own error. I had built a facade, neat and sturdy, but hollow at its back. A false solution again, instructive only in its failure. I leaned into the silence of the room. Books against shelves, the tick of a radiator, the distant bells attempting harmony. Margaret Prynne's calm returned to mind, her untroubled voice asking whether the chest had been difficult to open, the kind of question a woman asks who already knows the answer. I poured another measure, though the night had already had enough of me. In the margin of the crossword I wrote the word omit, 4 letters, no clue provided. It felt closer to truth than anything I had circled all evening. Some confessions arrive by omission. Some puzzles survive by being left unsolved. And outside, the bells carried their discord into the wet air, one note refusing to agree, the enigma inside the chest continuing to breathe through silence. It was late when the thought returned. The bells had roused me first, their imperfect chord spilling from St. Aldate's tower, a wrong note that carried into the marrow of the night. I had told myself to sleep, but the bells refused, and so I sat with whiskey in hand and let them summon the case once more. They were not announcing the hour. They were reminding me of something I had allowed to slip back into obscurity. The chest, always the chest, I had accepted too quickly that it had been locked in the ordinary fashion by the turning of a key that any of 3 men could have possessed. But the hinges had spoken differently. No scrape of hurried metal, no clumsy insistence, only the quiet dignity of something closed from within, or by hands trained to persuade rather than compel. I remembered the oil on the mortise, the neatness of the descent. A key may perform the task, but knowledge performs it better. Lewis had once asked, almost idly, whether Prynne could have climbed into the chest himself. I had dismissed the idea with the impatience of the tired, but now the bells, hammering their reminder into the dark, returned the suggestion with the weight of possibility. Alive when placed inside, or at least still breathing when the lid came down. Locked by a mechanism not intended for casual use, a device clever in its antiquity. That was the riddle. A chest that had been secured without the theater of keys. I poured another measure, slower this time, and sifted through the files that had migrated across my desk. Among them a thin pamphlet with the shy typography of a forgotten press. I had read it weeks before in another case and dismissed it as scholarship for scholars' sake. Its author, Canon Milthorpe, then a young don with more zeal for parchment than parishioners. The title, Securing the Sacred, a survey of medieval chests in English chapels. The essay was earnest, overlong, padded with footnotes that pretended to humility but asked to be admired. And yet there, halfway through, he described with careful pride the mechanism by which certain liturgical chests could be fastened internally. The lid descending into silence, no key required once the trick was known. I closed my eyes and let the recognition harden. Milthorpe, arranging hymnals with the steadiness of someone who had learned order as defense. Milthorpe, aligning the visitor's register to its edge with more devotion than the liturgy demanded. He had touched the chest with the knowledge of a craftsman, not the reverence of a priest. The choir boy's overheard phrase returned. Locked away forever. Not a threat in Vale's ledger voice, not an academic warning in Rainsford's syntax, but a man who had studied the language of locks until it had entered his prayers. It explained, and yet it did not. Why now, after years of careful anonymity? What debt from youth had ripened into murder? I glanced again at the photograph Lewis had rescued from beneath the cushion. Prynne, Vale, Milthorpe. In their green years, the chest behind them, shining like a conspirator. They had rehearsed something together then, rehearsals, given time, become obligations. I reached for the crossword left open beside the lamp. 7 down. Trick of memory. 5 letters. Slight would do, but the crossings refused. I wrote lapse, then rubbed it faint. It seemed to belong to me as much as to the grid. I had lapsed in forgetting the essay, lapsed in hearing the bells without understanding their insistence. They were not discordant by accident. They were there to remind me that harmony is a fragile arrangement, easily broken by a single note that refuses compliance. I leaned back and listened to the city sighing under rain. The key had not been used because it was never needed. The mechanism was older, subtler, almost invisible. Knowledge had become the true instrument, and knowledge was the one thing Milthorpe had never lacked. I let the whiskey settle in the glass and did not drink. Answers, when they come at midnight, are too fragile to celebrate. Better to let them breathe, like the bells themselves, imperfect and insistent, carrying into the silence their reminder that nothing is ever truly locked without someone willing to listen. The porter said the chaplain was in the vestry. I found him with winter light flattening the dust and his hands arranging service sheets into their proper obedience. He did not ask why I had come. He aligned a pencil with the edge of the table, the gesture of a man who has mislaid authority and learned to govern instead the small republics of stationery. I told him the bells had done what they were meant to do. The key, I said, was theatre. The chest could be sealed from within if one knew the trick taught by older carpenters. His eyes met mine once, then settled on the grain of the lid as if scripture had been written there and recently erased. We had both grown tired of euphemism. I placed the photograph upon the chest. Prynne, neat and inward-footed. Vale, rehearsing ease as though it were a discipline. Milthorpe, a half-pace back, shoes so diligently polished they reflected a boy, anxious to qualify for belonging. "Youth is a language people forget," he said. "Once promotion trains them to prose." "The past," I answered, "has a longer memory. Blackmail speaks every dialect." He considered that and replied that Arthur preferred reminders to sums, and some arrears are paid in silence because money cannot reach them. It came slowly, a confession forming like mist over a lawn. There had been a night, a dare, phrased so elegantly no decent young man could refuse it. The chest was part of the merriment, the lid lowered on laughter while the bells were coaxed to cough, so the time might be miscounted. Someone, he would not say who, remained shut longer than the joke permitted. Panic then, prayer then, vows to God and to one another, the lid lifted into daylight and shame. The college's forgiveness stayed tidily unwritten. Their own, promises, unwitnessed but unforgotten, lasted. Prynne kept the memory like a master key. He did not threaten careers so much as govern behavior. He wanted the chapel left to its arithmetic. He wanted order where ceremony had once failed him. Years softened nothing. A codicil here, a reprimand there, a quiet insistence upon obedience, and then the quarrel in the chancel that the choir boy stored like a hesitant hymn. Locked away forever. It was not a phrase minted for menace. It was the old word their summer had taught them to fear. "Why forever?" I asked. "Because," he said, "the word had lived in our mouths since that summer, and because I was tired of being placed at the back of my own life." "Pride," I said. "And shame," he answered. He spoke like a man reading notes taken long ago. He described the mechanism without ornament, the gentle descent, the guided lip, the palm's persuasion, the sound that is not quite a sound. Arthur had been alive. He might have slept if fear had not proved louder than faith. "I closed him in," he said, "as a man closes a door he has rehearsed closing in memory for years and has finally found the courage to shut." Silence made the vestry larger. In it I heard St. Aldate's wrong note accept its office again. Vale's Latin, the will he likely misunderstood, the blunt comfort of money, decorations only. Helena Rainsford's absence had the decency to be exact. The motive was older, poorer, truer. It was the treaty of boys who had grown into men with habits. It was the photograph developing itself across decades until one of them blinked. "We sign things with our younger hands," I told him. "Later, when the hands tremble, the signatures remain unshaken." He bowed as if to examine a rubric written on the floorboards. Lewis waited in the aisle with the patience the living owe newly named guilt. He asked whether the chaplain had confessed. He had, I said, but the truth had practiced too long to blush. We stepped into the quad. Rain had found the stone and taught it a darker vocabulary. Milthorpe followed at a distance under his own umbrella, a man who had decided at last to stop tidying margins. I watched him cross to the porter's lodge and understood that paperwork would begin soon, as it always does, to give names to what sorrow prefers to keep general. Back in my rooms, I opened the crossword as one opens a window. 5 letters. Sin that masquerades as virtue. I wrote pride and left the letters faint. Another clue offered old debt. 6. Arrear satisfied the grid and failed the heart. I closed the paper and let the city distribute its rain along the colleges. The case had narrowed into something almost simple and therefore difficult to explain. The chest was a tool. The key that wasn't used had been waiting all along in the past, and the past, as ever, proved the only locksmith we truly obey. They filed the papers, stamped consolations, and led Canon Milthorpe away with the formal kindness institutions keep for their own. Rain crossed the quad in veils and lost itself on stone. Cases end as terms end. Not with revelation, only punctual departure. Margaret Prynne asked for a word in the parlour where portraits practice endurance. She thanked me with a smile that would not choose a meaning. Arthur disliked uncertainty, she said. He made lists for Sundays. I asked if the balance felt just. Balance, she replied, belongs to accountants and dancers. Grief keeps other books. Her hands were still on her handbag, yet one nail held a crescent of wax, as though a candle had been pinched into obedience. Lewis caught up outside, coat open. He buttoned nothing, as if haste could be tidied later. "It's justice," he said. "A confession, a death. Lines meeting where they ought. Friendship asks for a cent, so I gave it, then added that justice is a ledger without margins. People write in the gutters, and the sums never agree." He said the college would sleep. "Colleges," I told him, "dream in Latin and wake in English." We crossed the quad in a thrifty wind. Millthorpe closed the chest with an art learned too young to know what locks are for, I said. Pride supplied the nerve. Shame the prayer afterward. Lewis watched a student hurry by, gown tugging backward. "There'll be talk," he said. "There always is. Talk is how colleges breathe." At the porter's hatch, a heap of post waited. Friday repeating its contradiction. Air smelt faintly of polish. I touched the top envelope and felt the solicitor's raised crest, stubborn as memory. The chaplain's umbrella, labelled, hung on the wrong hook. Someone had set it there carefully. "Small corrections," I murmured. "Invent absolutions." "What's that, sir?" asked Lewis. "Only that endings tidy what lives cannot." I walked alone to St. Aldate's. The nave kept its temper. Beeswax kept its pact with dust. The chest returned to being furniture, the ambition of every scandal. I touched the lid and let it be. A scrap of choir paper hid under a cushion, "Grant us thy peace," and the pencil that had lifted one note left a sheen on the margin. Peace is a technical term in music. It requires resolution. The bell rope drifted, remembering fingers. Outside, the sky thinned from pewter to damp linen. I thought of Margaret again, her smile stationed between gratitude and release. Wax on the nail. An echo of the chapel, or a house where candles report the hour, or years beside a man who believed order could be persuaded to behave. I wondered whether Arthur's lists included forgiveness. People who love compartments forget where they put mercy. Back in my rooms, I opened the Times and found a clue I did not deserve. 5 letters. Fairness strained. I wrote equity and crossed it out. Another clue offered old wrong revived. 7. Resentment fit, and the crossings agreed. But I left it faint. I poured whiskey and let it rest. Lewis telephoned. The paperwork had learned all necessary verbs. "We are done," he said. "We are never done," I thought, but I gave him the answer he needed. I remembered a line I had mangled. Tennyson, summoned by defect. For men may rise on stepping stones of their dead selves to higher things, perhaps. Or the stones remain where they are, slick with weather, and we go on slipping, polite about it. Justice, if it comes, travels by a slower road than sorrow. I left the window open and waited for the bells. They came on schedule and missed their chord again by that faithful fraction. Oxford wore the sound the way a widow wears a ring she cannot remove. I finished the glass, turned out the lamp, and stepped into the corridor. Morse walked away, the sound of the bells trailing behind him like an unfinished chord.